Hey, there we go.
Travis, I expected better out of your quarantine beard.
It's it's not too bad. I mean, it's coming in. Come on. By the time this is all over,
Weird.
my hair and my beard, I'm gonna look like a caveman or something like
Oh, you were trashing his beer. You said beard.
that.
I hate
It's
your
been like
beard,
two
Travis.
weeks.
You're better by this time.
I mean,
Yeah.
all right. If you think you can do better, babyface, bring it on.
Oh, I can't.
Oh, growing down. Is this gonna be a thing now? Is like next week we've got to do a facial hair like exposition?
I would not do well.
We're gonna have to take a poll with our viewers. Uh,
Maybe that could be your mustache challenge that kind of got put to the wayside for March Madness.
Yes, we did have to pocket mustache man.
A quarantine beard challenge.
so it's just not showing up well because it's mostly gray. That's the problem.
Yeah.
Yeah. When you get to be old like me, Joe.
All right, well, we're about to go, we're about to begin our program History on Tap tonight. We're just making sure that we're up on the streams we intend to be up on. Do you guys want to talk about what we're drinking tonight?
Sure, I'll start us off. I am drinking Vixen, which is an Irish red ale from Old Busthead Brewery down in Fauquier County. And I got to say, it is one of the tastiest beers I've had in a long, long time. Really great beer. I also like to point out it's a twofer because not only am I supporting a local brewery, but I had this growler filled at Monk's Barbecue in Percival. They're doing growler fills, they're doing barbecue delivery, the whole 9 yards. They're even doing mason jars full of local beers to go. So if you need a local brew and some delicious barbecue, go to Monk's.
Nice.
What are you drinking, Allison?
Also an Irish red ale. I have a Smithwick's here. Bottle is here. It's pretty tasty. Love it when it's on tap, but in quarantine, a bottle will do.
Right.
Beggars can't be choosers. We gotta
No.
see what we can get.
Mm-hmm.
So
That is delicious.
I am going with Crooked Run that I got from Leesburg. I'm appreciative that they're still open. I'm drinking their Merrang. It's one of their sours. They've got several good sours, but Merrang seems to be one of my favorites so far. So I picked up some more from them, and I'm drinking out of a Freedom's Run glass. If there's one positive that comes from everything being canceled, it's the next upcoming Freedom's Run race that I probably don't have to do. And if Jim Broomall's watching, he's probably thankful that he doesn't have to do it either this May.
Very nice. Well, I'm also drinking Crooked Run this week. This is the Herbaceous Spaces. It's a Partland with partnership beer with Wheatland Spring in Loudoun County as well. So it's again kind of a twofer. Nice. Yeah. I believe we're ready to get started. I've seen someone has liked the stream on the Mosby Heritage Area page, which is good because my Google Chrome doesn't feel like working right now. So welcome, Internet people, to the latest installment of History on Tap. This program is brought to you by the Mosby Heritage Area Association in partnership with the Loudoun Museum. You may have visited our on-site events supported by the library system here in Loudoun County, but we have gone on the grid, I guess, technically, on the grid to bring you guys History on Tap while we are, in our separate spaces. Tonight, we are joined with a special guest, Alison Herring, who's an independent historian. You may have seen her, though, in Loudoun County at some of our various events, both lending her knowledge and enlivening the room. Tonight, of course, we are talking scandal. We're talking about dramatic events from the past, some local stories, some further reaching, but I think you'll enjoy all of them. I hope that you will all consider checking us out, both Mosby Heritage Area Association and Loudoun Museum. We are looking for new members, looking for folks to join, looking for folks to show us some support. Let us know if you're watching. Let us know what you're drinking. Post a pic of yourself. If you're watching from home, we'd love to see you guys. And as always, comment with your questions and we'll get updates throughout to answer those for you. So Before we get started, I of course need to mention my other co-host, Director of Education with the Mosby Heritage Area Association. I've already mentioned Alison Herring. And then we also have Travis Shaw with me at the Mosby Heritage Area, and Joe Rizzo, who is the director at Loudoun Museum. So I'm going to have us go around again. We've already said what we are drinking, but let's go around and also say what we'll be talking about tonight. And I know that, Joe, you'll be starting us off, so tell us very briefly, give us a commercial.
Yeah, so I'm going to talk about dueling in early American politics. So I'll cover the reasons why duels happened, kind of what led to it, the process of getting to that point, or sometimes not getting to that point. And I'll use an example of two Loudoun politicians who did ultimately duel in 1819 to kind of walk you through the process of how, why, where, and what happened.
Very nice. And I think, Alison, you're going to be next on our list. What are you talking about tonight?
So I'll be sharing a letter from the Powell family papers that are at William and Mary. That this particular letter was written by a young woman who was 19 years old, and it's about a kissing party out in Henry, Illinois that got out of hand. It's so much fun. It was a big enough party. It was a big enough deal, scandalous enough. She wrote home to her family in Alexandria about it. So it's good stuff. And we'll learn a euphemism for kissing in the 19th century.
Enticing. What about you, Travis?
So I'm going to be talking about the tempestuous marriage of Sally McDowell and Maryland Governor Francis Thomas. This would explode into one of the biggest public scandals of the 1840s, all kinds of wild accusations, and would eventually derail a presidential nomination. So as far as scandals go, it's a pretty big one.
It is pretty big. It's pretty big. And I'll be talking about possibly an even bigger scandal, which is, of course, the 20th century's infamous Wallis Simpson, who ends up marrying Edward VIII. But the fun part of this story is that it has a local connection to here in this area, to Loudoun, Fauquier, and even the Front Royal area too. So we'll have wide-ranging scandals to talk about tonight, and we're gonna hand it off to Joe to get us started.
Nice.
Yeah, so as I just mentioned, I plan on talking about dueling in American politics. I didn't plan on talking about this topic, but as usual, I got into a rabbit hole of going from one thing to another. It went from issues about Andrew Jackson to his duels, to his recommendations. And then I realized that we've got a local good duel to kind of give you a good understanding of why duels happen and what happens. But I want to talk more broadly too, to kind of set the stage about why duels happen. And I think there's a lot of misunderstandings about them. And I think a lot of people just assume that, you know, maybe two guys get angry at each other, one slaps them or something and says, I demand justice or satisfaction, and they go outside and they shoot at each other.
This is done with a glove, right, Joe? I saw Bugs Bunny do this.
I saw Homer Simpson have it done too, and that's kind of how it all started for me too. And it's much more complicated like that. It's not emotional. It's not a spur of the moment thing. This is actually a very drawn out process a lot of the times for duels. And if I was going to make a hot take, it wouldn't be that duels are courageous. It's that they are really fear driven. And they're fear driven because they're concerned that if they don't defend their honor, that it's going to destroy their political careers. So a lot of the decisions they're making are calculated, and there's other people giving them advice about how necessarily they should respond to attacks on people's character. And it really comes down to the word honor and their standing in society. And a lot of the men who are doing duels are men of influence in societies or politicians. And I should mention too, again, like who's doing dueling varies greatly. Now, let's say, you know, as someone who considers themselves a gentleman in society gets insulted by a man that they would view as a lower class, they wouldn't challenge that person to a duel. What they would do is typically cane them or just beat them. Of course, the most well-known version of that is with Preston Brooks and Charles Sumner in Congress. But typically, you only duel with someone who's on the same social status that you are. So these are men who view themselves as gentlemen, and the way in which to go about in a gentlemanly fashion when you have this outrage over someone's character is to do so through a very calculated and orchestrated duel. And I'll get into the back channels that go to it. But there's a lot that take place in the early 1800s. One of the reasons is because there are no really clearly defined political parties. There are political parties, but they are not as entrenched as we would view them today. There's Federalists, which typically view stronger centralized government, more favor on commerce. And then there's Democratic Republicans, which are typically smaller government and then more personal liberty. But they aren't fully formalized yet. So if someone gets insulted by a person of a different party, they don't have a party system already in place to defend them and to basically find as a safe space, which means that your character to be defended is really mostly on you. And you've got to be on the lookout for anybody who challenges that. Because if you don't defend yourself, why would you expect people to follow you as a politician? So they're very fearful that if they don't respond appropriately when challenged to something, that could be devastating for their political career. And there's certain buzzwords and alarm bells that when they go off, it signals that a duel could be on. So some of those words, for example, coward, liar, rascal, scoundrel, and puppy. I don't get the puppy part. I've never heard someone call someone else a puppy, but it's bad news, I guess. When it happens.
That's how serious it is. They don't even go there.
Yeah, so if you get called puppy, I mean, it could be grounds for dueling. Again, like those words are intentionally used in the press, in speeches, and they're really ways to call out someone's manhood and call out someone's honor. So it's basically an individual of a duel, and then goes this process for an affair of honor. There's people very well known who take part in these kind of duels or close calls. Everyone knows Alexander Hamilton's ill-fated duel with Aaron Burr. That's not the only time Hamilton dabbled in potential duels. He had almost a dozen, affairs of honor, as Joanne Freeman calls them, where he came close to going to a dueling ground, but it worked out where it never happened. Loudoun's James Monroe has multiple instances where he considers challenging duels. He even asked James Madison about potentially asking John Adams to duel. But logic said, well, one, he's the president of the United States, and he's an old man. So you're not going to be the guy who wins a duel against an old man who's president of the United States. That's really a no-win situation.
It also sounds like one of those like, hey, don't tell him this, but what if I challenged him to a duel? Like, could you ask? Could you ask him?
Middle school.
Yeah, exactly.
So that goes into really the process of it, as there's all these sort of back channels that are going on. And again, it's a calculated thing. This isn't like a heat of the moment challenge where there's a process of there's an aggrieved person. They then use their back channel, what they call seconds, to go to the seconds of the person who did the wrongdoing, and they either challenge a duel, they basically demand satisfaction on behalf of who they're representing. And most times those seconds work on various negotiations to de-escalate the issue. So whether it involves an apology by someone, if it deals with a misunderstanding or clearing the air, most duels and challenges never actually get to the dueling grounds. Even if they do get to the dueling grounds, it's kind of a damned if you don't situation for a lot of people, and I'll get into, especially if you do end up killing someone. So oftentimes they're intentionally, if they do end up dueling, aiming towards the knees. Sometimes a last second negotiation succeeds and it's called off even at the moment of it. So there's a lot of reasons why they don't ultimately get to duels where they're trying to actually kill each other. It's not bloodlust. This is really, again, just a way to try to preserve your honor and your standing within your political community. So on that story, I want to give a specific example of two people from Loudoun County, Armistead Thomas Mason and his cousin, John McCarty. So again, they are related. They're both related towards the Mason family, George Mason being the most well-known of them. And for the story, again, they're just north of downtown Leesburg. Mason owns Selma, just north of Leesburg, and McCarty's at Raspberry Plain. So again, this is blood relatives here who are going to get into this duel.
They're basically neighbors at that point, right? I
They
mean,
are.
Yeah,
Those
they
are
are.
really
They're both-
close.
Yeah.
But consider Leesburg right now just north of the downtown area. So this is a feud years in the making. And there's a lot of bizarre reasons how they even get to the point that'll lead to a duel in 1819. They have similar lives. Mason is a graduate from William and Mary. He is a politician. He is in the Virginia militia. All right, Allison decided to cheers William and Mary, so I'll go with it.
Cheers.
William and Mary.
They're should we say
Sorry.
McCarty, you threw me off that cheers. McCarty is a politician, but also a farmer and a lawyer. So they both come, though, from distinguished families, of course, similar ones. What also is noteworthy here is that it's not just individuals, it's also newspapers and people advocating for their sides. So there's two newspapers that are really in the mix as well. There is the Washingtonian and the Genius of Liberty. And newspapers are extremely partisan in the 19th century. If you think cable news is bad, newspapers are even far worse than anything you'd see on TV today.
Terrible.
Maybe some exceptions to that. But also what these newspapers are having are people come in and advocate for causes or people under pseudonyms. So think of these as like burner accounts that celebrities and athletes have when they want to try to defend themselves. They can't do it in person, so they have fake accounts on Twitter, for example. Pseudonyms are being used in a similar vein. So there is one that is a big fan of Mason named Junius. McCarty's going to have his own Old Gouty. I don't know why he picked that name, but that's his that he's writing for on his own behalf.
So these are bots, essentially, right? Is
What's
what we're
that?
getting at? Is they've got bots?
Yeah, sock puppet
They basically
accounts.
got- yeah.
Like, yeah.
Yeah, so this all starts with an election, not even between McCarty and Mason, but between Mason and another Virginian, Charles Fenton Mercer. And Mercer, also from a distinguished family, Princeton graduate, a fellow military officer in the militia. They run for the same office, and ultimately Mercer wins. And this, along with another amendment that Mason had tried to pass, starts a feud between those two. And it starts Mason and Junius, that pseudonym, attacking Mercer and his policies. And then after the lost election, they even challenge the legitimacy of the election, saying that the Loudoun votes show irregularities, that there were people voting who didn't own property. And again, at this time, property rights are, for most states, requirements for voting eligibility. And also that people were voting too young of age. So they call into question the whole election. Mercer's camp responds with the same thing, saying there's irregularities, all right, but they voted for Mason. So there's some back and forth between Mercer and Mason. So this isn't even with McCarty exactly yet. So it leads to some name callings. And I already went through some of the buzzwords.
What is he? Which one does he use? Which one sets him off?
Is he
Hold on here. Hold on. I got some
Puppy.
quotes. First, we have Mercer, who calls Mason a blackguard and a bully. Not good, but not one of the buzzwords. Mason calls Mercer an infamous liar and a scoundrel.
Ooh.
Yeah, there you
Is
go.
scoundrel on the list?
Scoundrel's like number one on the list. This is something you do not want to call. So that means game on, like that's essentially almost a challenge for a duel. And Mason does challenge Mercer to a duel. But Mercer's got some coverage for saying no to it. For one, he's a politician, and Virginia politicians take an oath saying that they won't take part in duels, also on religious grounds. So Mercer says no by saying this: as a man, and more especially a Virginian, I ought not to accept your professed challenge. As a Christian, I cannot. Mason counters with that, saying that Mercer was a consummate hypocrite and a most contemptible coward. So again,
Oh,
Yeah.
doubling down.
but Mercer was shielded by the anti-dueling laws of Virginia and the oath that politicians took. McCarty, now to bring him back into the story, is a proponent for Mercer. So this begins a feud between the cousins, Mason and McCarty. McCarty also has political ambitions, and he is running for the House of Representatives. He's 22 years old, but Mason, for other reasons I haven't even talked about, has had drama in his past about being underage for holding office. He, who is angry about how McCarty has defended Mercer, I wish they would have had different names that didn't all start with M. But follow with me. So Mason, according to the anti-Mason Washingtonian, says that he called McCarty a perjured scoundrel for lying about his age on the courthouse in Leesburg grounds when he gave a speech. Again, McCarty's 22, but it doesn't matter. He's still being accused of lying about his age. McCarty counters his cousin by saying that Mason had a, quote, paucity of talent, which rendered him so conspicuously dumb in the Senate of the United States.
That's awesome.
So this back and forth, again, this is now years in the making, still before the duel even takes place between these two cousins. So they move on. It's more back and forth between the two camps on the sides. And then the newspapers get back involved again. For example, McCarty wins the seat that he was running for. But once he wins, he actually declines taking the seat because he doesn't want to take the dueling oath. So to keep himself basically eligible to duel, he declines that seat in Congress. So the duel is still very much on the table here. Then the newspapers pick up on this, and they are, again, basically fanning the flames between these two. You've got letters then that get published by Mason and McCarty. And the Genius posts these, and they post letters that are more favorable towards Mason's character. And I will say these newspapers are all digitized. God bless digitized newspapers in the isolation era. I went back and, again, got down a rabbit hole a couple nights ago, reading through literally the days and years of these back and forths in the newspaper.
Amen.
Digitized records.
So after that takes place, the Genius posting these letters, McCarty challenges Mason to a duel. So the challenge is out there, but at this point, neither really wants to duel. They kind of like the idea of it for their honor, but they've got some things going on. Mason accepts it, but he wants to clear it with the governor that it wouldn't hurt his position in the militia. You also have him that's recently married, and he's either expecting a child or just had one. McCarty's courting someone, so it seems like a bad time to duel for both of them. So it kind of cools off. But then again, the newspaper once again gets in the mix. So here's a quote from the Genius. This is May 26, 1818. Again, you can go ahead and find these yourselves online. He says that General Mason then agreed to meet Mr. McCarty and is on his own terms, finally to become the challenger if he could be assured that Mr. McCarty would fight. But all in vain. Mr. McCarty would not fight on any terms, and yet he has published General Mason as a coward. Can such a man have any sense of honor or even shame? Let the public judge. So again, he's saying that McCarty isn't willing to fight, but then he's possibly calling Mason a coward. So the newspaper is basically trying to reverse course and paint Mason in a better light. McCarty responds then by publishing letters himself, and he has letters then between the two published. There's pamphlets between the two that go out, and then I don't know this for fact, but I'm going to at least say what
anyway.
Reputation is. Supposedly, Mason got advice from Andrew Jackson. Now, there's one man who does not hate a duel. It's Andrew Jackson. And that's how this whole thing for me started, was looking at some of his. And supposedly, he suggests that Mason go through with the duel. And again, I can get, if there's a question, I'm happy to talk Andrew Jackson and his love of dueling. So if that happened or not, either way, Mason challenges McCarty to a duel. He resigns his spot in the militia. McCarty now, though, at this point in his life is reluctant to fight, but Mason's seconds threaten that if he doesn't duel, they're going to paint him as a coward in the news. So McCarty agrees to it. And then what I respect on McCarty is he looks at some unconventional ways to duel. So it, by and large, is usually with pistols, but his suggestions first go to other means. So one of his suggestions is with a dirk, which is a knife that naval officers used. So credit him for originality here, trying to do this in a different way. The seconds, though, say this is not following duel protocol and tradition. So it's decided on dueling muskets, one shot from 10 yards apart.
Musket. Dueling musket.
That's a bold.
So it's still
choice
pistolized,
right
I think, but single shot smooth bore that they're obviously using, again, because it's 1819.
I think we should bring back the dirks, though. That's a knife fight. That's essentially a knife fight.
All I can think about is like West Side Story. Like,
Yes.
And then they snap
Yeah,
and
and
went
then
all the
they
way
do
to the dueling
this,
field.
and then they sing a song.
So they agreed to then the weapons of choice, and it was established that they're not going to fight, obviously, in Virginia because that is illegal. So there was dueling grounds that had been well established outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. The Bladensburg, is it Bladensburg or Bladensville?
Bladensburg.
Bladensburg dueling grounds, aptly called Bloody Run. And in the 19th century, they had 26 confirmed duels, and I think it's like around 50 duels that take place there.
So isn't that where Stephen Decatur's killed in a duel there, right?
Yeah, that's the most well-known
Yeah.
duel that takes place. And just northeast of Washington, D.C. So they go there and they duel on February 6, 1819, 8 a.m. A bit early for me to get up and duel, but either way, they go through with it. There is no last-second negotiations between the seconds, and the duel goes through, and both end up being shot. The risk you take when you duel. McCarty gets a minor wound. The bullet hits his gun, goes through his left arm. It's a minor injury. Mason takes a bullet in the chest, and it is a mortal one. It kills him. So he does not survive that. His body is brought back to Loudoun, and at Osborne Tavern, his body is laid to rest on Loudoun Street in Leesburg, and he's still buried in Leesburg, Virginia. McCarty, now at this point, he's probably thinking, oh man, I actually killed the guy. He's scared for his life. He goes up to New York City, basically to wait out the backlash from killing Mason. He comes back a year later, supposedly with his family. He's always regrettable about murdering Mason, or I should say killing Mason. I don't know if it's murder or not, depending on how they view it. Supposedly, his family says he always tries to help people work out quarrels to avoid potential duels in the future. The newspapers report it. They talk about it. Again, the Genius of Liberty in the latter part of February, I think it's the February 26th edition, they bring up, again, more rumors that are floating around. And one of the rumors floating around is that the seconds for Mason goaded him into the duel.
Mm.
So what they do is they publish the letter that Mason sent to his seconds for them to have specific instructions for when they talk with McCarty's seconds. Basically to show that Mason is very much pushing for this. He is not being prodded into this, that this was of his own choosing. So again, doesn't really work out for either. And it's weird how duels typically have no winners in them. I won't extend the story any further. I know I've gone a little long, but it's just crazy to me how like duels happen. And usually when someone ends up getting murdered, people are like, what's wrong with you? How are you actually killing someone? Because again, they're not meant for murder and blood. They're usually meant for defending one's honor, which is why most don't happen and why it seems like a lot of times they shoot low to try to avoid that. But in Mason's case, Hamilton's case, of course, there's obviously a risk when you talk about dueling. Dueling falls out of favor, though, even before the war, but especially after the Civil War. So in honor of Mason, I say we cheers him for that.
Pour one out for our homie.
Yeah. It is a good idea, though, if you do accidentally kill someone in a duel, to show up a year later with your cute family with you. You know, I'm just like, hey, don't take revenge. Look at my adorable children.
Yeah, I know we did have a couple of questions. Again, for the duel that Travis mentioned, Travis, was that in the 1850s? I can't remember when that was. It was after this duel.
Decatur.
Decatur, 1820s.
1820s. Yeah, so I'm trying to think too about, someone asked like when when was the last high profile duel between politicians? I'm trying to think of the last one that actually took place. Northerners at the latter part of the 1840s and 50s basically laughed it off sometimes. But I think Joanne Freeman showed that actually when the Republican Party gets more into power in the 1850s, they're more willing to potentially stand up for themselves in terms of violence. Benjamin Wade, I think, very much showed a willingness to duel. So I can't recall the last high profile one. I mean, there's much more common ones in the South. Northerners usually laugh it off. There's challenges though that go all the way up to the Civil War. I know there's a duel at the Bladensburg grounds after the war. I think the last one there was 1868. But again, the duels really fall off. There's enough blood during the Civil War. So duels really come out of favor in the entire country, not just in the North by the Civil War. In terms of done with blades, is another one someone asked. I don't really know any duels amongst politicians that's anything but dueling pistols. And again, this is not violence and this for the sake of violence. This is them going through a very long, drawn out process to be able to get to that point. They're following a very strict code of dueling. The blades, though, will be much more common in a bar fight where that spills outside.
Yeah, I think there's a story involving Abraham Lincoln when he's a young politician and he gets into a duel and he chooses like long swords as the weapon because he's got like a foot height advantage over the other guy, and they both kind of like laugh it off and nothing happens. But
yeah, I mean, I don't want to talk any more about it because I've taken up too much time, but like there's really weird stories of Andrew Jackson's strategy that goes about, but I'll defer though because I've gone a little long here.
Who's next?
I think next is Travis.
Yeah, I'll go. Absolutely.
Yeah.
I'm glad you brought up dueling because that is going to play kind of a minor role in my story. Like I said before, I'm going to be talking about one of the biggest public scandals of the 1840s that you've probably never heard of. And it involves a weird abusive marriage, all kinds of horrible accusations, and a fistfight between two state governors. But we're going to begin our story with Sally Preston McDowell. Sally is born in 1821, and she is one of 7 daughters of James McDowell and Susanna Preston. The McDowells are one of the most politically connected families in Virginia. Through her mother's side, she's a descendant of Patrick Henry. Her uncle is Senator Thomas Benton of Missouri. Her other uncle is Senator William Preston of South Carolina. So again, kind of the political class that Joe was talking about earlier. Like a lot of well-to-do young ladies, Sally was sent away to school. When she was 15 years old, she was sent to Georgetown. Now, while she's there, rather than focusing on her studies, it seems she really just kind of circulated around the Washington social scene. There's a lot of accounts of her as, you know, this beautiful young lady, very charming, very affable, very intelligent. She certainly catches a lot of people's eye. Unfortunately for her, she catches a lot of married men's eyes, which will kind of come back to haunt her in the future. She has a reputation as being kind of this vivacious and flirtatious young lady. So one of the men that she kind of catches the eye of is a 37-year-old Maryland congressman named Francis Thomas. I know, yeah. This isn't even the scandalous part. The part of the story. They had been staying at the same boarding house in Washington, kind of running in the same social circles, and Thomas is kind of a rising star at this point. He's a 5-term congressman from Maryland. He's from Frederick County. He was Speaker of the Maryland House. He's president of the C&O Canal for a little while. So, I mean, really an up-and-coming politician in the Democratic Party, big supporter of Jackson. It's an odd match, not only because of the age difference. Both her parents, both Sally's parents and her aunt and uncle, are kind of against the match from the start, at least according to them. They kind of see Francis as, you know, this temperamental guy, not a very nice guy. Little did they know how bad it was going to be. But in her own words, Sally set her cap for Francis Thomas, and she had decided that this was going to be the man that she was going to marry. So they court for a few years. When she turns 20 years old, they finally get married June 8th, 1841, at the family home down in Lexington, Virginia. As I said, her parents are not thrilled with this. Her aunt and uncle, you know, it doesn't seem like a likely match, but at least politically, it's, you know, seems like it could bear some fruit. You know, well-connected Virginia family, well-connected Maryland family, both strong Jacksonians. So again, she's 20 years old. She marries this 42-year-old man, and they move to Maryland. And it's kind of interesting because as they're getting married and as they're moving, Francis Thomas is actually putting his name in the ring for the governorship of Maryland during this same year that he gets married. He's running for governor. So they move to Maryland. She has no family, no friends. She doesn't know anyone. They're living in Frederick or just outside of Frederick. So she asks Francis Thomas if maybe he could hire her cousin, this guy named Robert Taylor. Taylor would be a perfect fit for his law office, and Francis says, sure, invites him up, gives him a job in his law office, gives him a place to live, pays this guy's salary. According to Sally, they're just like siblings. They've grown up together. They're so close. They're inseparable. This is really where I think the trouble starts. In a lot of cases, we see older men being very, very jealous of their younger wives and the men that they associate with. And this is that taken to the extreme. Francis starts to notice that Sally and Robert sit a little too close together. Every once in a while, he kind of catches them in like a compromising conversation. He claims to have caught them in the garden of the house, just being a little too close.
Isn't there a Bonnie Raitt song about this?
I'm sure there's a bunch of country.
Like half country music right here.
On one occasion, they're all out riding in a carriage together, and Sally and her cousin start making fun of Francis's clothes and the way he dresses, like kind of old man. Look at this old fashioned buddy right here.
He's an old man. He's true to form.
Losing his
absolutely.
ego. That's not good.
One of the most damning things that happens is, according to Francis, now again, this is according to him, she tells him to go out for the day, that she's going to be doing some stuff around the house, and he returns home unexpectedly, and he finds Sally and her cousin in the parlor, and they totally do one of those things where like the door opens up and they like jump apart, like had been sitting in like a very compromising conversation and tried to act like nothing was wrong. So
this is bad news.
Yeah, it's really. And keep in mind, they've only been married for like a few weeks at this point.
Yeah.
This July 23rd, like just over a month from them getting married, he confronts her and is like, I have evidence that somebody broke into the house last night, snuck in, visited your bedroom. Like, you need to tell me the truth about all this. And he forces her to sit down and write a letter telling her cousin that he's been like too forward and inappropriate and he needs to go back to Virginia. So Robert leaves. Hopefully things get better. No, of course they don't get any better. Once the seed of jealousy has been planted, he's going to start like accusing every man that seems to sit too close to her, talk too close to her, including her own doctor. Her doctor comes in and like he hears them laughing at one point and bursts into the room, starts like shaking his fist in his face, like screaming at them. Later on, Sally describes this cycle as she felt like a mouse being played with a cat. There's this cycle of abuse, like accusation. He tells her, I'm going to call or write to your parents, have them come take you back to Virginia. I don't want to see you anymore. I'm sick of this. And then like 5 minutes later turns around and is like, I'm sorry, it's my fault. Like, you need to come back. I can't live without you. It's really a cycle that you see in a lot of abusive relationships.
Get out, girl.
Yeah, right. So again, we're still in 1841. He's still running for governor when this is all happening. The campaign starts to pick up. He sends her to stay with his sisters. And in September of 1841, she's staying with one of Francis's sisters and wakes up in the middle of the night. She's groaning. She's very ill. The sister comes over to see what's wrong. And what ends up happening is she miscarries.
Oh.
She says nothing to her husband about it. So Francis Thomas, he's on the campaign trail. He has no idea that this has happened. He doesn't find out until he happens to stop in at his doctor, and the doctor offhand says, oh, how's your wife doing after what happened? And of course, yeah, everybody's like, what do you mean what happened? And he says, oh, the 8-week incident. He keeps referring to it as 8 weeks. This baby, this fetus was 8 weeks old when she miscarried. And he said, like, what do you mean she miscarried? 8 weeks. And that's when he counts back 8 weeks and realizes that it was right around the time that he thinks someone broke into the home to visit her. So all signs are pointing to the cousin at this point.
It's like Days of Our Lives.
I
know.
know.
This is a wild story.
Edge of my seat.
So he freaks out. I mean, just absolutely, this is probably the worst confrontation that Sally and Francis have. He brings up this that she had not told him, and there's also some evidence that he thought he might have been like sterile, and that it had to have been someone else. So he grills her and grills her and grills her and breaks her down to the point where not only does she admit that she had the miscarriage, but she, at least according to Francis Thomas, says that she induced it using a powder that she had purchased from a doctor.
Wow.
Now, in the 19th century, this is infanticide. I mean, she could go to jail. She could, face death for doing this. This is a huge, huge, huge deal. She says in her own words, ever suspicious, relenting, declaring he would not live with me, then exclaiming, how I can't live without you. It just goes on and on and on like this for weeks, and he threatens to expose her that she's killed his child and all this other stuff, or that she's killed her lover's child. And again, I like to point out, this is while he is running for governor.
Wow.
So this drags on. This episode, he finds out about it in September. He's elected to governor that fall. He's sworn in January of 1842. He wins the election just barely, by like 600 votes. Shortly after his inauguration, her parents, James McDowell and his wife, come to Baltimore, grab her from Annapolis on their way, and take her home to Virginia. And this is like really a weird break in 19th century society, because this is still a society where like the husband rules the roost. So like the only man who can really publicly challenge a woman's husband is her own father. Now, as it turns out, James McDowell was also running for governor of Virginia. So here we have the sitting governor of Maryland, who is now married to the daughter of the sitting governor of Virginia. As you can imagine, this is going to start to pick up in the press, that there's trouble in paradise, that things are not well in the Thomas household in the governor's mansion in Annapolis. The public in both states really, from the get-go, sides with Sally against Francis, which again is kind of unusual in the 19th century. She's portrayed as the victim of this abusive guy, this guy who's kind of like out of his mind. Not only do the newspapers pick up on this, a lot of church leaders surprisingly pick up on this. Again, we think of the church, specific, she's a Presbyterian, we think of the church being pretty conservative at the time, but well-known, like nationally known Presbyterian ministers start like speaking up on her behalf, saying like, you need to divorce this man, he's crazy.
And almost governor.
Yeah, so she goes back to Virginia with her parents. He stays in Annapolis as governor. This goes on for months and months and months. Finally, April 1843, so over a year since she's left, they've been in some communication via mail. Francis decides, well, the legislature's out of session, so maybe I'll take a trip to Virginia to go visit some people I know.
Some people I know.
Just so happens he's going to be heading up the valley and heading through Lexington, where he knows his estranged wife is. So Francis Thomas, governor of Maryland, steps off the train at Staunton, Virginia. And who does he run into at the rail depot but James McDowell, governor of Virginia, and his father-in-law. And the two of them see each other and just lay into each other. Apparently, James McDowell takes out his umbrella and starts whipping on Francis Thomas. It takes a crowd of people to separate the two of them. You can imagine the governors of two states just going at it in public, just wailing on each other. William Preston, who again is uncle of Sally, senator from South Carolina, says, basically commends James McDowell on the blow he gave that reptile.
Yeah.
Francis, for his part, calls the governor of Virginia a cowardly assailant. So again, going back to what Joe was talking about earlier, pulling up the
buzzwords here.
Cowards.
And this is really like a turning point in this whole case, because now Francis is like, I don't care about my reputation. I don't care about her reputation. I don't care about Annie's reputation. I'm going to destroy everything. I'm just going to lay everything out in the public and let the public decide like who's in the wrong. So he threatens to reveal this to everyone. He's going to step up his attacks in the papers up in Maryland. He's just going to start printing all kinds of wild stuff. He actually, in December of 1843, prints broadsides and has them put up all over Virginia, daring James McDowell, the governor of Virginia, to institute a divorce case in the Virginia legislature. Because in the 1840s, if you wanted a divorce, it had to go through the legislature. So it is absolutely nuts. Francis Thomas is going to obviously. He's going to write letters to Robert Taylor, the cousin that she had supposedly slept with, calling him out, basically daring him to come and fight a duel. Robert is going to ignore that because, like Joe mentioned, basically his friends are like, this guy is not worth it. You know, obviously this guy's such a coward, such a reptile, such a scumbag that like it's not worth your honor to fight him.
Is he a puppy?
He probably, I'm sure he got called a puppy.
He's one sick puppy.
Eventually, the legal case is going to involve Reverdy E. Johnson, one of the most famous lawyers of the day. Thomas actually retains him first, but he looks over the case and is like, no, Sally's in the right here, and actually switches sides to support her family. Once the term of office, Francis Thomas's term in the governor's mansion is over in 1845, that's when like the legal cases pile on. Now, keep in mind, this is 4 years after this marriage has fallen apart. First of all, he gets sued for libel by Senator Benton, who he's dragged into this. So that's a federal case right there. He responds by doing, I think, the craziest thing in this whole thing. In 1845, Francis Thomas publishes a 52-page pamphlet known as the Statement of Francis Thomas, where he details his side of the story and absolutely everything. Every man he accuses her of having been, you know, adulterated with. He lays out the details of the supposed abortion of the child. He lays out, starts dragging Senator Benton and his family into this, the McDowells, all these personal correspondence that went back and forth. 52-page pamphlet that he then has printed, and a copy is placed on the desk of every single person in the United States Congress. If that's not crazy, I don't know what is.
Modern day
Actually, if you
Twitter
Google
thread.
the Statement of Francis Thomas, you can read it online, and it is
Ooh.
juicy. I mean, it's like, this guy is nuts. And this is what will finally spur the divorce proceedings, because basically the McDowells realize, well, it's already out on the table now. He's had his say, so we might as well clear the air. And Sally was smart enough to retain every piece of correspondence they ever had, including all of the apologetic letters that said, oh, I made everything up. I'm kind of crazy. I'm just insecure. It's my fault that this happened. So they're going to counter with that. So there's a divorce proceeding that goes through the Maryland legislature and the Virginia legislature. And of course, as these cases go public, the galleries pack with spectators. One newspaper talked about the spectators were waiting for these wonderful disclosures of this family quarrel. I mean, this was probably the best.
Everyone loves families that are more dysfunctional than theirs. This is
Yes.
Right. Yeah, I mean, this is like us watching reality shows today,
Yes.
right? Like,
Yeah, it's the
watching
same
celebrity
thing.
marriages
this is
fall apart.
rivaling Joe Exotic.
Yeah, right. I mean,
It's
I don't know about
close.
that,
Let's
but
not
it's
go
close.
crazy.
Close. So finally, 1846, the Virginia House of Delegates unanimously grants her divorce, and unanimously grants her last name back, which again is like kind of unusual in the 19th century that they would, you know, restore her name. The Maryland legislature followed right afterwards. So finally, 6 years, 1846. This has gone on for, you know, not 5 years since they got married, is how long this case kind of dominates the headlines, not only in Maryland, but in Washington, in Virginia. Certainly one of the most scandalous cases of the day.
Wow.
Just a little bit of epilogue on what happens to these guys.
Are there many defenders, not to interrupt you, of the Maryland governor?
No. Francis Thomas,
that guy.
like, he has a really hard time finding anyone who will take his side. Pretty much the entire public opinion is against him. Even a lot of his friends kind of, distance themselves from him, which plays into what happens to Thomas after, in 1844, while this is going on, his name is actually floated as one of the most promising presidential candidates in the Democratic Party. But once these cases go public in 1845, like, nobody wants to touch this guy. This guy is like as toxic as can be. So it derails his presidential ambitions. He basically is wandering the political wilderness for the next 15 years. And it's not until the Civil War that his public image is rehabilitated. He comes storming out at the forefront of kind of the unconditional unionist movement in Maryland. He's elected by a landslide back to Congress in 1861. He organizes kind of the unionist support in Maryland, and he actually authors the 1864 Maryland Constitution that outlaws slavery. So that's like, if you visit his tombstone today, he's like, this is the man who authored the act that gave freedom to 90,000 human beings. Says nothing, of course, about the fact that he was the craziest, most insane, jealous husband of the 1840s. I do get to tell you guys there is a happy ending for Sally.
Oh, yay.
You got a really nice happy ending for her, actually. In 1854, she meets a man named John Miller. He's a super famous Presbyterian minister from New Jersey. And they kind of go into correspondence together. All of his people in his church and his community are like, don't touch this woman. She's been tainted by this scandal. She's basically damaged goods. You don't want anything to do with her. He ignores them. They get married in, I want to say 1856, like a few years after they met. He's a widower with 2 children. They move in together. During the Civil War, he actually serves on Stonewall Jackson's staff and stuff like this. He survives the war. They live happily ever after until 1895. The 2 of them actually died within a week of each other. So like they have, and all of their letters have actually been published. So they have like this incredibly warm, loving, wonderful relationship. She actually kind of talks through a lot of her experiences with this abusive first marriage. One of the things I think is interesting is, to the end, she never really blamed Francis Thomas so much as like felt sorry for him, like pity that this guy was so crazy and made her life so miserable. So
Wow. Charles, a question from Facebook saying, I would imagine money or dower rights has to be involved here in some way. Any record of this in either state?
So one of the things that comes up when all this happens is supposedly Thomas, one of the things he's angry about is that like he expected more dower rights and like money and stuff from her family and doesn't really get it. I mean, she's one of 7 daughters plus 3 sons. There are 10 children in this family.
No money moving downstream.
No.
He makes the claim that her parents wanted the marriage because he was so well connected and like there was political advantage there. But that's something that her parents really shoot down from everything that they say, that there was no material advantage to this wedding for either party. Really, it's a sad situation.
But we can cheers a happy ending.
Yeah, screw that guy.
Yeah.
Here's Sally.
Everybody watching at this point
Sally McDowell
in the Facebook world can drink to that happy ending, at least too.
Yeah, Francis Thomas is actually killed. He's struck by a train accidentally. So there you go. Karma.
No, I'm going to erase that. We're ending with the happy ending. They lived happily ever after.
That's right. The auditor in me loves that Sally kept a CYA file. Like she kept the documentation.
Absolutely.
In writing. Get it in writing.
Yeah, I'm surprised more historians haven't latched onto this because there is such, I mean, literally hundreds. She has like 500 letters that she kept that details this whole situation.
That's a lot.
Yeah.
Smart.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, is it me?
Yeah, keep the party
Yeah,
going.
Let's go to a kissing party. That's where we're headed.
I don't know if that's
so-
proper social distancing.
No, there's no social distancing at this party whatsoever. None. So for those watching that aren't familiar with me, I'm Alison Herring. I live in Richmond, and I'm an independent researcher, and I'm working on the Powell family papers that are lucky enough to be at William and Mary. They're in the Special Collections Research Center of SWEM Library. Shout out to SWEM Library. A lot of them are watching.
Love the SWEM. Yeah.
The librarians and the archivists, we see you. So these papers are, it's a huge collection. It's about 700 items, but the number of, because I'm counting the number of pages as I go, because thinking about 700 items, that almost belies how big it is. And these people are from Loudoun County. So all of you watching from Loudoun, this is good news because they recorded a lot of history from that area. So they cover primarily the 19th century. Oh, and I was saying that I'm counting the pages because it's what we CPAs do. I'm projecting there's going to be 3,600 pages, and that's just what's at William and Mary. So there's more at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. There's more in Alexandria, and there's more at a couple of other locations that I've yet to visit. Oh yeah, and there's more at UVA that recently came to light. So it's a big collection. These were prominent people. So people in Loudoun County are thinking, which Powells? That's a big name up here. So this is the family of Charles Levin Powell. He was the like sidebar genealogy moment just for the Loudoun crowd. So he was the son of Cuthbert Powell of Llangollen and the grandson of Levin Powell of Middleburg. So that kind of orients the Loudoun crowd of who we're talking about. And his wife was Selina Lloyd. So the Powell family papers are primarily this family's papers covering from about 1900 through about, 1800 through about 1900. So most of the 19th century. So they lived in Loudoun County, and then they moved to Henry, Illinois. So shout out to everybody from Henry, Illinois that's watching. Hey, yeah. Henry, we see y'all.
Crossing state lines tonight.
It's on the Illinois River. It's about 45 minutes north of Peoria. So it's between Peoria and Chicago. Delightful town. When all this social distancing is over, I recommend it. So the Powells moved out there. They built a home, and their house still stands. It's still there. The couple that live there today are restoring it, and they post a lot about that on Facebook. It's really delightful to see that house coming back to life. So the letter that I'm going to be sharing is a kissing party that happened on New Year's Eve of 1852. The letter was written in 1853 on about January 3rd. It's written by a girl named Hattie Powell. She is 19 years old. So this is a teenager. She attended the party with her brother Lloyd, who is 18 years old, and her sister Minna, who is 17 years old. All right, let's see, what else do I want to do to set the stage on this? One thing that's important to note about Hattie Powell's letters that you're going to see when I read this is that she's very detailed and she sets the scene. So she doesn't just tell you, hey, I went to this party and here's what happened. She goes into a lot of detail to explain to you how, she sets up the scene almost like a playwright would. So you feel like you're there and that you're witnessing it. You're gonna feel like you went to this kissing party with her. So almost like being a fly on the wall. Also,
was that Joe?
So do you define kissing party?
Maybe
it's in the name. I'm sorry, but
it is not
more here.
It is not a thing. This is a unique thing that happened. It's not like there were kissing parties that just happened in the Victorian era. This is the kissing party.
I don't know. I think we're going to learn they had kissing parties in the 19th century. They did. And
obviously, you've never been invited to a kissing party, Joe.
Never been invited.
They did. These people were not nearly as prudish as I think history has led us to believe that they were. They were about some things, but not about everything. Also important to point out, she's writing this letter to her sister, Rebecca, who's her older sister. Rebecca has traveled from Henry, Illinois back to Alexandria, and she is hanging out, going to parties and balls with the Alexandria elite. And I mean it. Grandma and Grandpa's house is Lloyd House in Alexandria, as in the offices of Historic Alexandria today. So Grandma and Grandpa were the Powells were more prominent on the Lloyd side of the family. So Charles Powell married well when he picked Selina Lloyd. And so Rebecca is having a great time. And I think part of the tone of this letter is that Hattie's making sure that her sister and her cousins and her aunts and uncles know that, like, hey, we're holding our own out here in Henry, and check out this kissing party I went to. So I think that's important to point out. She calls it a bussery bee. So what I learned from Carolyn at William and Mary, shout out to Carolyn, is that to bus somebody meant to kiss, and that's an old word even for the 1850s. So Hattie calls it a bussery bee, making it clear, kind of like if you're going to a quilting bee, you're going to be doing some quilting. You go to a bussery bee, there's going to be some kissing going on.
Yeah.
That's a thing. Yeah. All right, y'all ready?
Yeah.
Buckle up. So I'm going to read how she wrote it because she's so stinking delightful. If I were to paraphrase this, it would not be the same. And I want to give you guys a sense of what these Powell family papers are like. So here we go. We're going to dive in. She says, I must tell you of the bussery bee. Min and I went to New Year's night. It was at Mrs. Jones, and I was very much surprised to see so large a company of young people. I did not suppose so many could have been collected, nor such a number of good-looking, gentlemanly young men.
Mm.
The invitations were very prettily written. I love how she's setting this up.
Wait, so there are
Invitations were
invitations
very prettily
Written.
like,
Mhm.
like, come on down to the
Hour.
kiss
Come kiss people.
That's right. The hour, 7 o'clock, quite fashionable, was it not? See, she's like, see, we're holding our own. Well, just as we were all sitting in the dining room with our wrappings on, waiting for the appointed time, a rap at the front door was heard, and in a few moments, brother, who was going with us, ushered in two very gentlemanly and quite handsome young gentlemen who he introduced to us as Mr. Giles and Mr. Jones. This is important. They've been introduced. That's important in the 19th century, especially on the East Coast or back with the Alexandria elites. You're not supposed to talk to people that you haven't been introduced to. There's still a lot of formality to the socializing on the East Coast, but what we're gonna learn in a moment is things in the West are a little more relaxed. There's gonna be a bit of a culture clash. Okay.
Stranger danger.
Stranger danger.
Stranger
Mhm.
danger. It's real.
Mhm. So now they've, she's described it, right? They're in the dining room, they're waiting, they've got their wrappings on. There's a knock at the door, and it's brother, and it's Mr. Jones and Mr. Giles. So they informed us that they had brought a carriage, and would be happy to escort us to the party. They made themselves very agreeable during the ride, but left us at the gate to go for some of the other girls. So I love that. So like Mr. Jones and Mr. Giles and Lloyd Powell are driving around town in this carriage, picking up girls.
Picking up girls.
Picking up girls.
It was a good carriage, though, I bet.
Yeah, like spinner rims on the carriage and stuff.
Right. Rims on the carriage. Because Lloyd, having all these sisters, knows a lot of the young women in town. So obviously Mr. Jones and Mr. Giles were like, hey, like, we're gonna drive around and pick up all the women, like literally. All right, so now she's at the party, right? She's been left at the gate, she goes in, now they're at the party. She says, I never in my life saw such an impudent man as Mr. Albert. He was not introduced to me, but he came and took his seat by my side. I immediately turned round to the table and took up a book and did not speak a word to him.
Yeah.
How awkward is that? It's like the 19th century version of your earbuds. So as shocked as we are that she would do that, 100%, like the crowd in Alexandria is like, oh, he just sat next to you? Like you haven't even been introduced. So what's probably happened, because Hattie is very witty and she's very funny at parties. So I think somebody has gotten up to go refill his punch, and Mr. Albert's like, now's my chance. I'm gonna go sit down and meet this Hattie lady and see what this is about. And that does not end well for him at all. So.
Wow.
Right. Then she writes, now for the kissing.
Now for the
This is the
kissing.
moment in the archives where I was like,
The moment we've been
What?
waiting for.
yeah, because I didn't know what a
Amen.
bussery bee was when I originally transcribed this letter. So I was like, now for the kissing. What are you? I worried, do I have that transcribed right?
It's a weird
These
term.
young people.
I know. All right, here we go. She says, they began to play pleased or displeased. I did not know the game, but was told, yeah, so here comes part of the game.
Tell me more.
Right. I did not know the game, but was told that if I said I was pleased, I would have nothing to do. So I said I was pleased. So she's playing it safe. I don't really know what's happening here, so I'm just gonna say I'm pleased.
Like truth or dare kind of thing.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes. I think it's very much like truth or dare. Yeah,
But with
the dare
kissing.
being kissing. Yeah. So there was quite a pretty and nice looking girl there, a Miss Clisby. She said she was not pleased. She was then asked what would please her. So, right, they're going to ask you, okay, what would please you? She said, for Mr. Jones, a gentleman who she had not been introduced to and who had never seen until that night, to measure 6 yards of tape with her.
Wait, what?
Then she stood up in the floor and with as bold and unblushing a face as you ever saw, while poor Mr. Jones was dragged by mean force out of his chair to kiss her.
Yeah.
There's a lot to unpack about that. So apparently, to measure 6 yards of tape with somebody in the 19th century was a euphemism for kissing.
6 yards?
Yeah,
Six
why
yards.
not 5?
It's the sexiest measurement.
Gotta be 6.
I'm confused.
Yeah, measuring 6 yards of tape. And I love how she throws Miss Clisby under the bus. She
Yes.
was like, she says like a gentleman who she has not been introduced to, and she further emphasizes and has never seen before that night, as if that somehow like makes it even worse. Like not some guy
Yikes.
she's just seen around town.
These randos just picked her up in a carriage and then she's kissing him in the
That's the
middle of
problem
the floor.
Right, because Mr. Jones is one of the ones riding around in the carriage. Maybe she's mad. She's like, "Oh, you went for all the other
Yes.
girls. Like I had
Yes.
to trudge myself here in the snow because this is in February. I'm sorry, it was in January. So like I've got to drag myself here."
I'm gonna keep this in mind whenever people complain about like young people today. Like, there's nothing new. This is
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And I love how like apparently Mr. Jones wasn't into this. She said while poor Mr. Jones was dragged by mean force out of his chair to kiss her. So apparently he's over there like, what's happening? I don't
Yes.
know. They had to drag him.
Yes. So also poor Miss Clisby, who had to stand here in the middle of the floor while some guy gets forced to kiss her.
Yeah.
yeah, that's a bad look.
Identified who she was. That took some effort. I'm pretty sure this was Louisa Clisby. She was living in Lakin at the time, so she was not from Henry. Later, the Clisbys did live in Henry, but she had been living over in Lakin at this point. So interesting.
Louisa Clisby, the
Louisa
notorious
Clisby.
kisser.
Mhm. All right.
Get it, girl.
This gets awkward. So
We're not there yet?
yeah, so we're not even at the good part. So Hattie then says, I asked him afterwards how he liked it. She went to,
Mm.
she's like, so how'd that go? This is Mr. Jones. He said, oh, very well, only he thought it was rather a rough introduction to a lady. Like, yeah, I'll say. She says, what do you think of it? I was very much shocked. Shocked, yes. Loving every minute of it, also yes, I
Yes.
think. Yeah, because she's got some good material to write to her sister about, right? Okay. Then she writes, now I come to the most interesting part of the bee. I was like, wait, this gets better?
Yeah.
She says, that in which your dignified sister figured. Mr. Albert, remember him? He's the one that she spurned him on the couch. So he's probably licking his wounds at this point and is like feeling a little miffed, maybe looking for some revenge. Mr. Albert then announced that he was dissatisfied. Imagine my horror upon his asking what would please him to hear him say, to see Mr. Groves measure and cut 6 yards of tape with Miss Harriet Powell. There was a general shout and jump at Mr. Groves. Deacon Poole exclaimed, ah, Jim Groves, you will have to stand it. Nobody ever seemed to imagine that Miss Harriet Powell would object. Mr. Groves at first told them to let him alone. He was not going to get up at all, but that did not satisfy them. So he got very mad and said something about complying with anything reasonable, which they required, but not that. So this is where it starts to sound like truth or dare, where he's like,
Yes.
pick another. So She says, I was so much agitated. I did not hear what he said exactly, but I heard Min, Brother, and Maria say it was a most excellent reply, and tell you what, they dropped him like a hot potato.
Nice.
She has no idea what he said, but whatever it was, like, it was awesome.
I didn't realize potatoes were dropped for such a long period of time. I didn't know that was
Yeah, that's been a phrase. I mean, she's dropping that phrase here like everybody knows what it means. So definitely since 1853.
What if she coined it?
Hmm.
I would love that. I don't think that's the case. That'd be great.
Probably not, but wouldn't shock me. Okay, so she says, would you not have liked to have witnessed the scene? I mean, we kind of did. She wrote about it in so much detail. That Minna and Maria looked indignant, contemptible. Brother's eyes flashed fire, and they tell me they never before realized that looks and actions spoke louder than words. I sat perfectly still and looked daggers. Brother says he shall forever think better of Mr. Groves. Very sweet. But measuring tape, I looked into it, and I did some research on newspapers.com a couple years ago.
Oh, I bet you did, Allison. Did some research.
Very thorough, very thorough. So and newspapers.com is worth every penny. So people watching who don't know what that is, we're quarantined. I mean, I would pay the fee because, or yeah, however, I forget how much it is, but it's worth every penny because you'll entertain yourself for days on that website. But I did find a couple of references. So there were maybe 100 instances. You have to wade through all the like dry goods store measuring tape ads, but there were about 100 that refer to a kissing party, but it's the same 2 articles that got, I don't know what the word is, like syndicated or serialized across the country. And I clicked, the auditor in me, I clicked through every single one to make sure that it's the same 2 over and over and over again. And the first one is a serialized story, and it dates to 1904, and some of the newspapers ran it in 1905. Where a character is made to kiss somebody, and they refer to it as measuring 6 yards of tape. So it's again the 6 yards. The other one is an article, Travis, getting back to one of your earlier points about kids these days. It's a grumpy old man whining in 1915 about how children are deteriorating. And he says, you know, today it is the tango, while a dozen years ago it was a kissing game and measuring 6 yards of tape. So, but these are more than 50 years after Hattie Powell makes the comment about measuring 6 yards of tape. So the origin of it is still a mystery to me. I have an article written about it on my website. So if you want to see those 2 references and read the story again for fun, it's on my website. But I put a note in red on it that if anybody knows where somebody does, it's out there somewhere. Why is it measuring tape and why is it 6 yards? And Lloyd Powell uses it in his stories, what he writes home from Henry a lot. He'll say, oh, I was at a party and, you know, we were measuring tape, etc. And so we know, because I would imagine if somebody came across that, they would think, why are you measuring tape? That's so weird. But we know from Hattie Powell that meant kissing.
They're making out.
Yeah. All my
it's a spin the bottle party.
Right. So all of my historic tailor friends that are out there right now who measure tape, like, tell me what this is about. Somebody's got to know. So,
I know.
like,
I've even asked around at Williamsburg. Nobody I've talked to at Williamsburg knows. There have been some theories, but that, you know, the auditor in me is like, well, it's just a theory. We don't really know if that's what it is or not. I almost wonder if it wasn't a story that got serialized across the country and there was some joke in it and it caught on like pop culture.
Yeah.
For something to be that widespread, for her to mention it to her sisters, although she did define it as kissing, which almost makes me wonder, was Rebecca gonna know that that's
like a 19th century meme here, and like if you
yeah,
don't speak the language, you don't get it.
Well, it seems like something that's innocent. Like if I'm writing to my family, you know, like I'm writing to my big sister 6 yards of tape. You know what that means, wink, wink, you know, but it's very easy to pass off as, oh, it's okay, Mom and Dad, we're just gonna invite friends over and measure some tape. You know, it's one of those, it's easy to pass off.
Yeah, we're doing crafts. It's craft night. That's all we're doing. Other names for kissing parties were like post office was another one. Mhm.
licking
I'm forgetting some of the others. The post office stood, because I jumped down a rabbit hole of this last night on newspapers trying to figure out, making one last ditch effort, make sure I couldn't find anything else.
Bus Review, post office, measuring tape, all free for all.
Hey, just go to the post office.
I'm calling it for Henry, Illinois. Right now, unless somebody finds an earlier version, like measuring 6 yards of tape, Henry, Illinois. Looking at you guys.
Yeah.
Measuring tape.
The hardware store there can like have a fun ad about that.
Yes. The kissing booth meets sales coupon experiment. I like it. All right, well, we're gonna fast forward at this point. And I'll fast forward for just a hot second and then we'll track it back again, because the story that I'm telling has to do with probably the biggest international scandal of the first half of the 20th century. And that, of course, is when in December of 1936, Edward VIII abdicates his throne for Wallis Simpson. Woo! But the reason I want to talk about this scandal is because there are some interesting facets of it. There's some interesting pieces that actually happen on our side of the pond and even in our neck of the woods, if we can continue that, symbolism there. So, interesting enough, Wallis Simpson's story also begins with a scandal. So it's 1895, and a man named Teakle Wallace Warfield in Baltimore has tuberculosis. He's had tuberculosis for many years. He's the youngest son of a prominent Baltimore family. The family doesn't want to send him away, apparently, to try and get better. They want to pretend he doesn't have tuberculosis. And Teakle falls in love with a young woman named Alice Montague. And the couple are determined to get married, even though they know that Teakle Wallace Warfield's condition is terminal. Both sides of the family say, don't do it, don't get married, it's not worth it, it's just going to end in heartbreak, but they get married anyway. It just so happens Alice is 2 months pregnant at this point. So
there it is.
There you have it. And so in November that following year, Bessie Wallace Warfield is born in a cottage at a resort in Pennsylvania. The birth is not recorded. Birth records are not required at this point in Pennsylvania. So she's born with very little fuss, very little flash, and only 5 months later, her dad will die. Boom, scandal initiated.
Mm-hmm.
So Wallis, as she will later become known, Wallis grows up, she and her mother become the beneficiaries of her uncle's wealth. They live with her uncle Solomon, and Wallis grows up with this idea that they are always struggling, that they never have enough, let alone that Uncle Solomon has millions of dollars, and will let them live on an allowance every so often. Wallis grows up with this idea, again, that she is, she's not one of the wealthier friends. She is able to go to some of the best schools, so she goes to the Arundel School and to Oldfields as well. And it's at Oldfields that she makes a couple of longtime friends, Phoebe Randolph and also Florence Campbell. But she also meets someone that she thinks of as kind of a role model, but who she describes as a crush. And that is Charlotte Haxel Nolan, who we figured out was, a second cousin twice removed to Hattie. So, ta-da, connector.
Hello, cousin.
And Charlotte Nolan is teaching basketball at Oldfields. A PE teacher is not someone we usually think about with Ivy League credentials, but Charlotte had actually studied at Harvard, I think it was. And she had studied specifically physical education of that time, and of course would notably go on to found Foxcroft School in Loudoun County. So Wallis not only meets Miss Charlotte, teaching there at the school, but also makes friends with the other students. And for one of the first times in her life, feels like she actually belongs to a team, a very literal basketball team, but also a team of people that she feels like she can grow with and also associate with. And so Charlotte invites Bessie Wallace and a number of other girls down to Fauquier County, to Berland, her family's home, for summer camp, is essentially what it is. So if you can imagine going to summer camp, with Charlotte Nolan, it's a lot of horseback riding. They often go to Glenora, which is at that time owned by the Nolans' cousins, the Tabbs, and they go swimming in the ice pond, and there's a pool there too. They ride a lot of horses. They go to tea parties. They go to race meetings. It's a really amazing experience for young Bessie Wallace. There's actually a photo of her too at her cousin's house, the Wakefields. Lilia Gordon was related to her mother. So she feels as though this area of Virginia is this kind of wild and wonderful experience where she's finally surrounded by people who are peers who support her, and not just, stodgy adults, her grandparents and her, uncle, who are looking after her because they have to, kind of a thing. So Bessie has the soft spot in her heart for this area. And she'll, of course, end up, from 1910 to 1913, she spends summers here in this area again at Berland, again staying close to Miss Charlotte. And she describes her relationship with Miss Charlotte as having a crush on her, and maybe even being a little bit in love, with the older woman. And this is a way that a lot of the young girls who came to these summer camps felt about her, and is also a feeling that a lot of the people who went to Foxcroft School felt about Charlotte Nolan as well. She just had a way about her that was like inspiring and interesting, but also severe, in a way that was magnetic.
Sounds like a Powell.
Yeah, a Powell. That's a really good way to put it. She's definitely a Powell. But of course, as we know, Bessie Wallace was not destined to stay in the Piedmont. She ends up going to Pensacola, Florida, where she meets her first husband, Winfield Spencer, who was a naval pilot at the time. He was the 20th person to get his pilot's license. In the U.S., this is still a time shortly before the U.S. joins World War I, when aviation is new, it's complicated, it's exciting, it's sexy, and of course, Bessie Wallace falls in love with this young aviator, and they get married very shortly after. But of course, it's not fated to last. Apparently, when Winfield has a drinking problem, is weird and aloof, and like locks her in rooms for hours at a time. It's weird. It's not a Francis Thomas situation, but it's also apparently, it's not very healthy. And so after a trip to Hong Kong and Shanghai, where frankly Wallace lives very well, Wallace comes back to Virginia, understanding that like it's time to cut her losses with this marriage. And the way that she sees to do that is to go to a place that she has always seen as a calm place, which is, back to our area, back to the Piedmont region of Virginia. And so she goes to her friends living at Wakefield Manor, and they suggest that she get in touch with a lawyer there. And according to the rules in Virginia, which she thinks are very reasonable compared to elsewhere, it costs $300 to get divorced in Virginia in 1925. And also, Wallace writes, for a woman seeking a divorce, the price also included the prospect of being voluntarily buried alive for 2 years. And what that meant was you had to prove residency in Virginia for a year. And during that time, you couldn't collude with anyone else. You still had to maintain that you were not running off on your spouse and all this. And I think in Wallace's perspective, being in Virginia during that time was like being buried alive in comparison to being in Paris and Shanghai and and like all these exciting other places. So Wallace voluntarily buried herself alive in no other place than Warrenton, Virginia, from 1925 until 1927. And she lived very simply during this time. She was actually living on kind of an allowance from her still husband, Winfield Spencer, and she also had a little bit of money coming in from her wealthy uncle who had declared her his ward. So she was living at Warren Green Hotel right in downtown Warrenton. She didn't have any servants, she didn't have any help, just the porter, Jake, who worked there at the hotel. And at that time, the Warren Green was mostly home to a lot of traveling salesmen of the era. So there were long-term boarders there. So she was able to make friends. But probably the best friend that she had in Warrenton at this time was a man named Hugh Armistead Spillman, who was from a Warrenton family and who worked as a teller at the Fauquier National Bank just across the street from the hotel. Wallace herself says he only earned $125 a week, which meant that he could not support her. I think she was already like calculating things in her head. But Hugh was actually an old friend from the Oldfields days in school in Maryland, when he would come up to visit friends that he had, and he would take them to go to dances or go to tea parties or, whatever else it was. And it just so happened he had a car. So Hugh became Wallace's ride to all of the social events in the Warrenton area. So we're thinking the early days of the Gold Cup that are happening in that part of town. We're thinking hunt races. We're thinking tea time. We're thinking tennis. All of these, social milieu things that can happen is what Wallace is going to try and gain entrance to. And while Hugh doesn't have much money himself, his family is reasonably well connected in the community, and and they can get into these things. But their relationship is not platonic, at least definitely not on one side of the relationship. We know for a fact that Hugh Spillman is head over heels for this woman, for this divorced woman. He actually, says at one point that that she was such a terrible flirt, but that he couldn't help himself. He was so taken with Wallace. Now, for Wallace's part, she was not going to, she wasn't cutting any corners here. She was very clear about what she wanted in life, which I think is a characteristic that we see emerge later when she comes on the international stage. At one point, she says, a friend of theirs actually hears her saying this, and she says, "Oh, Hugh, I'd marry you if you had any money." And like the friend thought this was so bizarre and like frankly gauche to say that she actually wrote it down. It's like, what? Can you believe this? But there's even someone else who remarks that, so Hugh himself apparently said that he was one of probably 30 individuals who proposed marriage to Wallace while she was in town during. I know.
30.
I know. Those are the rumors we hear from the time. I do not have a record of all those individuals, but that's the idea of this lady in the later 1920s, 1926, when she's here. And Hugh at least once formally proposes marriage to Wallace. And Wallace says, and I quote, "I'm poor, you're poor, we both need money." So in Wallace's mind, at least in this point in her life as a 30-year-old woman fresh off a divorce, is, you know what? I'm not looking for grand romance or passion. I'm 30. I want stability, and I want someone who can take care of me. And clearly that is not Hugh Armistead Spillman. So sorry, Hugh. She also said this was another kind of a burn. So we've established that Hugh is part of the horsey set in Warrenton. And she also says that she might have considered marrying him if he read anything other than the Daily Racing Forum.
Oh,
Sorry, Hugh. So a little, some, I think,
Or
good-natured, repartee between the two of them. But there's also a rumor, and this is more of a Warrenton rumor. I don't know that it's corroborated in any of her biographer's stories, but there's a rumor that, so Wallace had a second floor room at the hotel, and there was a rumor that she would dangle a scarf over her veranda, and Hugh would come up for a, you know, like a secret visit kind of a thing. Yes. One fact that is corroborated is that Hugh had a photo of Wallace hanging in his own room in the hotel, a big one, a big photo of Wallace hanging on the wall, and that every time he walked by, he would hug and kiss it. So cute or creepy, that's for you to decide as the viewer, whether that's like romantic, yes, or that's weird, no. But there you have it.
Right on the border there.
I'm getting
That's weird.
All these last two stories is it's all about the wheels, whether it be a carriage, a car.
It's true. It's true. Tips for men. Don't be crazy. Have some wheels and don't get shot in a duel. Like, these are all great
Straightforward.
tips. Yeah. Now, as I think all of our listeners will be aware, is of course the love story between Wallace and Hugh is never meant to be. Wallace ends up marrying a shipping agent in 1920. Gosh, it's right after, it was 1927. I think it was right after her divorce was finalized. She ends up going to New York to hang out with some friends, and then she conveniently falls in love with a man who is married, who divorces his wife so they can get married. True love. So this new man that she's marrying, Ernest Simpson, this shipping merchant, they kind of have an engagement for a few months in which Wallace is deciding whether or not to go through with it. And the day before she marries Ernest Simpson, she sends a telegram. And who does she send a telegram to? Hugh Armistead Spillman in Warrenton, Virginia. What? And this is what she says. I wrote it down. Oh, wait, where is it? Okay. It's short. But she sends this telegram to Hugh. Unexpectedly, I find myself marrying Ernest tomorrow. Much love, Wallace. So
that's it.
That's, as far as we know, those are the last words that she says to Hugh.
Wow,
Yeah.
That's harsh.
That's shipping money.
Unexpectedly, through a situation, I don't know how unexpected, I find myself marrying this guy. Anyways, much love, Wallace. So for his part, Hugh never married. Could it be he was pining forever over Wallace Simpson? I don't know. Pure speculation. But that wasn't the last time that Wallace visited this area. In 1942, as, of course, the Duchess now, she and the Duke come to Virginia. And part of it is to revisit some of these, these places of good memory for Wallace. They come and they visit friends, they visit Miss Charlotte, but they're also visiting again Clovercroft, which had been the home of a friend, but at this point in 1942, during the war, was hosting a whole day school of British children who had been shipped over there during the war to keep them safe. So this was an initiative that was only done actually for a few months in Britain, shipping children across to America, because one of the ships got torpedoed and like 70 kids died. It was really sad. So this day school of children successfully arrived to America and were actually living, at Clovercroft near Front Royal for 2 years during the war. So Wallace came back with the Duke, with David, I guess is what she called him. So they visited the area. They got to check in with any old friends. We don't know if they visited with Hugh Spillman. I doubt it. But Nevertheless, there were several connections, that she had in this area, and that I think she thought, very positively of our little, corner of paradise here.
Who wouldn't?
Yeah, there were a lot of fascinating things about her life, I'm sure, as you can imagine. But it was a lot of fun to kind of dig up the time when she was here. She said that when she was staying in Warrenton, she spent most of her time rusticating and the other part of her time vegetating, which I thought we could all relate to as we were kind of being forced
to
rusticate
calling it that.
And vegetate ourselves. Maybe not quite burying ourselves alive, but definitely some rustication. I also have kind of a fun personal thing here. So this is actually something my grandma gave me, that she was given. So this is the coronation pamphlet of King George VI, who of course became the king because Edward VIII stepped down. And this is something that my great grandpa purchased in Tonga when he was there for his Mormon mission in 1937. So
That's awesome.
yeah, it was just kind of a fun thing that I had in my bookshelf that I thought you guys might get a kick out of.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the link to the area, and I really had not ever heard that much about her before.
Before she was Wallace.
Right.
Something. And something else I found out that was really interesting to me, at least, is so she sent that message to Hugh Spillman right before getting married to her next husband. Well, apparently right before she married David, she sent letters to her then husband Simpson, saying like, oh, I wish I could take back how it used to be, things like that. It's like she always had like buyer's remorse before, moving on.
Wow.
Interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
So we've had
That is fascinating.
Scandals here.
Yes.
All
Yes,
across
a good night of scandals. Have we had any questions come in, Joe?
No questions from Andrew, who's monitoring the feed right now.
Everyone's just so enthralled with these stories.
Well, I have a question for you,
telegraphs.
Marie.
Question.
It's been my understanding that once the, kind of the years leading up to World War II, that the former Edward VIII or David or whatever we're going to call him, was maybe kind of a Nazi sympathizer.
Oh yeah, that's not even amazing.
Okay,
I mean, by all
He definitely was.
reputable accounts, he was. And unfortunately, I think Wallace shared some of those same opinions. So while she was rusticating in Warrenton, she was mostly reading fashion magazines and poetry, but she also read, that I'm blanking on it now, but it was the book that was written that Hitler called his Bible.
Oh, Mein Kampf or whatever.
No, it wasn't. No.
Okay.
It was before that, but it was something that I think she, and this is me speculating, of course, but I think that she is someone who grew up thinking that she was poor but entitled to wealth and greatness. I think it was something that she sympathized with, the idea that an Aryan race deserves, or can aspire to something. So I don't know if that's something specifically that she and David had in common that they bonded over, but we know that it was something that was in her reading record.
Wow.
With some of those ideas. Yeah.
Yeah, that was the part during The Crown where I hit pause and was immediately on my phone like,
what?
There's The Crown. I almost can't get through an episode without having to hit pause and be like, nuh-uh.
There's a photo. There's a 1937 photo of Wallace shaking hands with Hitler, with the Duke there, of course, the three of them there together. And during the war, I should say 1940, the Duke was made the royal governor of the Bahamas.
Mm-hmm.
So the two of them were tucked away during the war to a place they probably couldn't do too much damage, whatever, kind of a thing. But there was something else that was said about Wallace, was that, that was the first time when she was living in the Bahamas, that was the first time she shook hands with a black man. So if that's true, then like there's an interesting side to her life that she shook hands with Hitler before she shook hands with a black man.
Wow.
Which is not something a lot of us can say in history. it might be its own scandal a little bit,
Yeah.
but not a scandal we're prepared to get into tonight. So,
Man, so I think we're running low on time. Any parting shots or anything you want to plug for your own organizations? Or I will say the Loudoun Museum. Obviously, so Travis, can you confirm that we're doing next Thursday, 1861? Is that true?
Yeah, that's the plan. Next Thursday, we're going to be coming back with another Historians on Tap. We're going to cover 1861 as kind of the pivotal year that sets the stage for the rest of the Civil War. And if everything goes as planned, our special guest will be Dana Schoaf. He's an editor with Civil War Times Magazine, good friend of all of us, and really, really entertaining guy. So I'm looking forward to it.
Awesome.
And again, we'll try to keep this running every Thursday while we're all locked up in quarantine. So please join us. Please continue to support your local breweries and
your local historians.
And your local historians, yes.
I drank the most.
Yeah,
I got a refill. I got a refill partway through. So.
Are you serious? Dang it.
And I will say for the Loudoun Museum as well, we've got a blog that's up looking at various preservation projects. That's on our website. It's on our Facebook page. And also starting Monday, we're going to start posting some short interviews with local historians looking at local topics, national topics. So the first one of that will be put on our Facebook page on Monday.
Nice. Yeah, Mosby Heritage Area Association is doing a similar initiative. We're going to have just follow our Facebook or go to mosbyheritagearea.org. We have a bunch of remote learning resources there for kids who are out of school right now. We've got a blog that we maintain. We've got lots of really good content coming up. We've got videos throughout the week. I know everyone's hurting right now, but if you can support us, donate, maybe make a membership. Same for the Loudoun Museum. I know, Joe, you guys can use the help too. So we're all in this together.
Membership program.
We would love for you guys to join membership. Buy us a beer,
Yeah, right.
whatever you all feel. We're glad that you guys are here watching. I'm glad that you all are here listening. Really glad to have Alison on board tonight, and all of her friends from William and Mary and from Henry, and our viewers at home and abroad. Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you, guys.
The scandals.
The scandals.